Good evening, I'm Diana Skaya and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. A rare phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin is sending shockwaves around the globe. As Russia's war in Ukraine rages on, leaders are scrambling to respond to the potential peace talks. Now, more on that in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Behind our backs, Europeans raise caution with U.S. deal over Ukraine. Dozens are injured in Munich car ramming ahead of the International Security Conference. And Estonia claims Russia is preparing for a confrontation with the West. The West is grappling with the rapid-fire U.S. diplomacy surrounding Russia's war in Ukraine, which saw President Trump speak first to Vladimir Putin and then with Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, key Ukrainian demands, such as the return of occupied territories and NATO membership, were taken off the table. Now, the U.S. has also delivered a draft deal for Ukrainian rare earth minerals that Trump seeks to acquire. And now, Trump and Putin are set to meet in Saudi Arabia. Critics are saying that Ukraine has been sold out. Our John Todd reports.
Ukraine's president meets power workers the day after Donald Trump called Vladimir Putin to discuss the peace plan, then Zelensky. He said it stung to be called second.
I didn't interpret the call as one prioritizing talks with Russia. Of course, it's not pleasant anyway, as Ukrainians and Europeans agree strongly to the notion that Ukraine should come first.
From the Ukrainian point of view, given that the president of Ukraine has to pretend that he's happy that this is going on, etc. But look, he was not necessarily forewarned or involved in the preliminary discussion, long discussion that Trump had. And it seems like a sellout.
NATO's Mark Rutte welcomes US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to the organization's Brussels headquarters. Hegseth had a clear message.
The bloodshed must stop, and this war must end.
Hegseth told fellow defence chiefs that a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders was unrealistic and that Donald Trump's peace plan did not see membership of NATO as a route to resolving the conflict, both key demands for Kyiv.
Hi, good to see you. Mr. President, right on.
While the ministers were meeting, Zelensky welcomed US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He delivered the first draft of a deal that would see America acquire rare earth metals for the $500 billion Washington has invested in Ukraine's defense against Russia. Bessent said the mineral deal would provide post-war security.
By increasing our economic commitment through a partnership with the government and the people of Ukraine, that it will provide, once this conflict is over, it will provide a long-term security shield for all Ukrainians.
Zelensky plans to ink the deal before the Munich Security Conference. So what would the US buy? Ukraine has massive natural resources, estimated at between $11.5 and $15.5 trillion. And how would the deal buy security?
Workers and the mining and the refinement of these rare earth minerals needs to be done under an umbrella of security. And maybe the quid pro quo is that if you're processing these minerals, there'll be anti-air systems, there'll be artillery, there'll be ways to protect it.
While NATO membership and a return of lands annexed by Moscow are off the table, analysts say Ukraine still has cards to play.
And one of the things that Ukraine has leverage with is saying to Trump, all right, we've got $11.5 trillion worth of rare earth minerals. If you want that, our $500 billion is going to have to buy some kind of better U.S. security assistance than seemingly you're willing to offer at this point.
Trump is due to meet Putin in Saudi Arabia, where the Russian leader is free from the threat of arrest for war crimes under an International Criminal Court warrant. They'll have much to discuss, with Trump keen to conclude the conflict quickly. Ukraine, though, will be fighting to make sure there are no concessions and Russia is brought to book.
The Ukrainian government said on Thursday that Kyiv will not accept agreements to end the war if it is not included at the negotiating table. Now, joining us now live from the Ukrainian capital is our correspondent Oz Chatterjee. Oz, good evening. Now, before we move into reactions and what Ukrainians are saying about all this, tell us about the latest Russian attack on Odessa.
Yes, it was another successive Russian attack across the country. The port infrastructure in the southern city of Odessa was particularly impacted in this Russian drone attack, with infrastructure on the southern coastline being hit. We understand that one woman was injured in this attack as shrapnel hit her vehicle. Across Ukraine, we've had one person killed and 19 others, including that woman, 20 people wounded in attacks over the last 24 hours.
Oz, now, what is the reaction in Kyiv to the potential terms of President Trump's peace agreement that has, this caused quite chaos in the past 24 hours?
Well, look, the official line from Kyiv, as you heard in the previous package from Zelensky, it wasn't a very pleasant to find out that he'd spoken to Putin before Zelensky. But Kyiv is on a balancing act at the moment, trying to negotiate with Trump, trying to stay in his good books, while not reacting to every small thing that he says, no matter how inciting it might be to Ukrainians. I will say that we have a tweet put out by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs earlier. This seems to be in response to the US Defense Secretary's comments about what territory Ukraine may or may not be expected to keep. It's very clear the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there, what message they're sending out, that they consider the whole of Ukraine to be part of Ukraine, unsurprisingly. Now, while Zelensky is playing that tight rope quite delicately, opposition MPs are more able to speak out, to speak freely, because they are not constrained by those same diplomatic constraints. Now, Alexei Honcharenko, a member of the Rada here, spoke to TVP World exclusively earlier on today. Let's hear what he had to say about it.
We need to remind President Trump that it's Europe and Ukraine are American allies, not Russia. And that's very important. Again, the fact that Trump spoke with Putin is absolutely normal. But the comments of President Trump, some of his comments at least, about tougher cooperation with Russia, with visits to both nations and so on. Putin is a war criminal. Putin is a tyrant. Putin is a person who says, I hate Anglo-Saxons, I hate NATO and all of you. And then we hear such things. I think it's quite unacceptable.
I think that if anyone is expecting that this will be easy for the US to pull off with Donald Trump at the helm, they should just look at the statements coming out of both Moscow and Kyiv about what they think a deal looks like. And if you look and listen to what the government is saying, they are very, very firmly not going along with the lines that are currently coming out of Washington. So look, a lot to be done here before these sides are able to sit down and discuss anything. And just because Washington is insisting that it happens, doesn't mean the Ukrainians are going to simply go away into the night and let discussions happen over their heads. That's certainly the view from Kyiv anyway. Back to you in the studio.
A delicate matter indeed, and we'll definitely have to see how this all will unfold in the coming days and weeks. Thank you so much, Oz Chatterjee, coming to us live from Kyiv. A phone call that makes headlines is a rare occurrence, but a conversation between President Donald Trump and Russia's President Vladimir Putin has certainly captured global attention. Now, set against the backdrop of Russia's ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine and for prospect for peace talks, world leaders are reacting to the exchange between the two presidents. Sonia Agatabishyan has more.
Some see the Trump-Putin call discussing a Ukraine peace plan as betrayal of Kyiv. World leaders also shared other points of criticism.
In my view, it would have been better to talk about Ukraine's possible NATO membership or the country's possible loss of territory at the negotiating table first.
Numerous officials highlighted that Ukraine is central to peace talks involving their country.
Only Ukrainians that get to decide what is acceptable to them as an outcome of any peace negotiations.
Critics, including EU Foreign Affairs Chief Kaja Kallas, pointed out that Europe should be more involved in the peace talks.
It is clear that any deal behind our backs will not work. Any agreement will need also Ukraine and Europe being part of it, and this is clear that appeasement also always fails.
But referring to a post on X by Kallas, the Hungarian Prime Minister said that the seat at the negotiating table must be earned. Viktor Orban also dismissed a statement of support for Ukraine by Weimar Plus countries shared by the EU's top diplomat.
This declaration is a sad testament of bad Brusselian leadership. While President @Real Donald Trump and President Putin negotiate on peace, EU officials issue worthless statements.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte welcomed the call, adding that a peace deal should be durable.
What I consistently have said is we have to make sure that whatever the outcome is, we have to make sure that Vladimir Putin will never, ever try again to attack Ukraine. That is crucial.
Following a conversation with the U.S. President, Zelensky said he appreciated Trump's interest in jointly bringing peace, but he emphasized that Ukraine will not accept agreements made without its involvement.
It's important that everything does not go according to Putin's plan, in which he wants to do everything to make his negotiations bilateral between him and the United States of America. We, as a sovereign country, simply will not be able to accept any agreements without us.
Peace through joint collaboration was a common theme in the reactions of world leaders, including Poland's Prime Minister, who also picked up the phone.
After my Today phone calls with Zelensky, Costa, Scholz, Ulf Kristersson and CDU leader Friedrich Merz, the message is clear. Ukraine, Europe and the US must be fully united and engage in peace talks.
The German foreign minister furthered the notion that peace in Europe requires unity with American partners to achieve breakthrough developments.
The most important thing for us is that after 3 years of Russia's terrible war against Ukraine, we finally get the Russian president to come to the negotiating table.
In a joint presser with the Ukrainian defense minister, Rutte noted that the alliance's continued military support for Ukraine is needed to achieve and ensure a lasting peace in the country.
A man in Munich has rammed a car into a crowd, injuring at least 28 people. He was later identified as a 24-year-old asylum seeker from Afghanistan. Now, this comes just hours before the arrival of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Ukrainian President Zelensky to the German city, which will host the Munich Security Conference over the next few days. We now go live to our correspondent, Aaron Damon, who is in Munich. Good evening, Aaron. First of all, what more details can you tell us about these victims? Are there more than 28 right now? What are authorities saying? What's the mood like where you are right now?
Good evening, Diana. Well, we have just touched down here in Munich, and this city, of course, tonight is reeling from what officials are calling a suspected attack. You mentioned it a bit there, but from what we know, a 24-year-old Afghan national drove a car into a trade union protest, injuring, and that number has gone up in the last few minutes, at least 30 people, some critically, including children. Remember, this is a country that is in the middle of an election campaign, and this is an election campaign that has been growing in terms of anti-migration, anti-immigration rhetoric, and that has prompted the rise of the AfD. So the way that this will impact the German election campaign is yet to be seen. All party leaders have already come out to, of course, condemn the attack, but exactly how it falls with the German public, that is an open question. And it comes just a day out from this high-powered Munich Security Conference. J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, you mentioned him there, he's already in Munich. He is set to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky tomorrow, and we will be here covering the very latest from this conference over the coming days. But as for what to expect, well, Sasha Farbach has this next report.
Against the backdrop of Munich's wintry gloom, America's vice president steps onto German soil as Donald Trump's envoy, a presence met with quiet unease. The vice president has arrived for informal talks about Europe's security and the future of Ukraine at the Munich Security Conference. But among allies, doubts linger. Does Trump's representative truly stand in line with Europe? Some experts see him as a sign of transatlantic division.
J.D. Vance is not a supporter of helping Ukraine. He's not a supporter of working with Europe. If Waltz and Kellogg are pushed to the side, and we have to listen to Pete Hegseth or J.D. Vance as well as Donald Trump, we better get ready to be tough. And we will need to be tough, because if Europe does not stand with Ukraine, whatever the U.S. does, then Russia will prevail.
Hundreds of high-ranking officials will descend onto the southern German city for 3 days. Although no official statements or agreements are expected, it will serve as an informal gathering, especially to take the pulse on what Donald Trump will do next.
They want to find out what the Europeans are going to put on the table for a ceasefire in Ukraine, for the future of transatlantic security, the future of NATO.
Europe is sending its top brass to the summit to talk shop. Among Trump's envoy are Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The event will also see NATO chief Mark Rutte, Ukraine's President Zelensky, Poland's Foreign Minister Sikorski, as well as the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Some experts believe that the Europeans are still reeling from the White House's recent announcements concerning Ukraine's future.
For the US, Europe doesn't seem to be sitting on the table here, and the Europeans are kind of at a loss on how to react to this. There clearly is no agreed line in Europe right now on that question.
Although security will be the focus of the global summit, the attendance of 12 European commissioners highlights how serious Brussels is and reminds Washington of the power and the competence of the European institutions, especially the European Commission when it comes to trade.
These are fiercely competent bureaucrats. I mean, they've got their act together. As much as Europe is lagging behind in defense and, if you want, artificial intelligence and so on, Europe has its act together in trade negotiations. So make no mistake, Washington, these guys are important.
The event in Munich will also see the appearance of the conservative German frontrunner Friedrich Merz. With pivotal elections in Germany just a week away, those gathered will be provided a unique opportunity to glimpse the potential future leader of Europe's largest economy. Sascha Farbach, TVP World.
According to a report published by the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service, the Russian army is growing in numbers despite sustaining heavy losses on the Ukrainian battlefields. Now, if the war in Ukraine ends on favorable terms for Moscow, Russia will strengthen its military presence on NATO borders and remain a growing threat to the bloc. Our reporter Pavel Chaskovsky has more.
These are NATO troops patrolling the Baltic Sea. On Thursday, the Estonian Navy patrolled the Gulf of Finland to show the country's efforts to protect critical underwater infrastructure. It comes a day after the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service published a report on the country's security, a report that underlines a growing military threat from Russia despite the country's 3-year-long war effort.
Russia started the war in Ukraine with about 700,000 personnel in the entire armed forces. After 3 years, we see that the size of the Russian armed forces is already over 1 million. So despite all its losses, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, the Russian army has already managed to grow in number.
According to the report, more Russian troops are expected to be stationed on the Russian-Estonian border soon. Moscow has been stoking the flames in the Baltic Sea region since its 2022 invasion on Ukraine, intensifying after Finland and Sweden joined NATO.
You know what the Baltic Sea is turning into. It is no coincidence that when I talked about the need to protect the Baltic Sea from acts of sabotage, we talked about it because the Baltic Sea has become a bit of a lake, almost an internal sea of NATO countries.
Over the last 2 years, ships linked to the Russian Shadow Fleet were reported to cause damage to a gas pipe, as well as internet and telecom cables on the Baltic bed. But acts of arson, vandalism and cyber attacks are also used by Moscow to undermine the West's support for Ukraine. However, they have the opposite effect.
And I think our foreign minister put it very well in Parliament earlier this week, when she said that in these uncertain times, one thing is certain. In our region, we stand together and we stand strong.
Over the past 3 years, European NATO countries have pledged to boost their defense spending and increase their military capabilities, with Poland leading the way.
This year we will spend the most in our history on Polish state security. It will be close to 5% of GDP, 187 billion.
Defense initiatives like Baltic Sentry were launched, and the next steps involve boosting Europe's autonomous military capabilities.
The Polish presidency has practical proposals in this regard, including the activation of EU funding mechanisms and new institutions, such as a possible European rearmament bank.
Swift action seems crucial, as peace talks on the war in Ukraine are expected to be held soon. Therefore, putting Ukraine in the strongest possible position ahead of negotiations is key.
When they start, it's up to us to make sure that Ukraine is in these negotiations from a position of strength.
And the next step should be putting Europe in the position of strength. According to the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, if the conflict ends and NATO does not rearm, Russia might be ready for a large-scale war in Europe within the next 5 years.
And now I invite you to watch my exclusive interview with the Swedish ambassador to Poland, Andreas von Beckerath. Today on TVP World, we have the pleasure of welcoming the Swedish ambassador to Poland, Andreas von Beckerath. We'll be discussing some of the key issues shaping the relationship between Sweden and Poland, particularly following the signing of the Strategic Partnership Agreement. Now, with ongoing developments in the fields of security, defense, and the European Union, as well as Sweden's NATO membership, there is much to talk about. Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today on TVP World. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ambassador, now it's been 3 months since the signing of this strategic partnership agreement between Sweden and Poland. Now, the document did prioritize cooperation in many different fields, particularly security and defense, like I've just mentioned. Can we already speak of any concrete initiatives underway? What has already taken place, and what are the main goals, priorities for both Sweden and Poland?
Well, I had the honor and privilege to attend the meeting of our two prime ministers when this strategic partnership agreement was signed. And you can really sense that this was an important moment for both our countries. I think the agreement itself manifests the fact that relations between Sweden and Poland is closer than ever before. And this was also mentioned by a prime minister at the press conference. I think one important reason why our relations have solidified in the past few years is obviously the deteriorating security situation in our part of the world and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And also, of course, the fact that Sweden has joined NATO. This has sort of added a dimension to our already close relation. I think that that's why it's quite natural that we focused on security and defense in the agreement, because it's so important at this point of time, even though there are a lot of other important elements such as economic cooperation and trade. But it's enough to look at the map to realize how important our partnership with Poland is. Our security is Polish security and vice versa. And I think our foreign minister actually put it quite well earlier this week in her speech to our parliament. She said that in these uncertain times, one thing is certain. In our region, we stand together and we stand strong. And I think that really holds true for Sweden and Poland and our cooperation.
Should we feel threatened? Should we be aware that even if the war, ends, that it may go further? Estonia's security service, had mentioned that Russia would most likely think of advancing past Ukraine, and you just said that.
I don't think we should be afraid. We should be ready. And we should be aware of the fact that we're in a long-term confrontation with Russia. I think we have to realize that this was not caused by us. It was caused by Russia. And the best way to strengthen our security is to do it from a position of strength. So we have to make sure to limit Russia's ability to cause harm, limit Russia's scope of action, both politically, economically, and militarily, not least through further support for Ukraine, military support for Ukraine, and also further sanctions against Russia in order to restrict Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine.
Right, I do have that as part of one of the points of the strategic partnership agreement here between both Poland and Sweden here, and is to ensure coherence, cooperate on further sanctions, just like you mentioned, towards Russia and increasing their
But let me just come back to the agreement as such, because again, a centerpiece of the agreement is security and defense. And there's several areas where we have already come quite a long way when it comes to our cooperation. The most obvious point is, of course, security in the Baltic Sea region. Where we believe that Sweden has a lot to offer, not least our geography. We have the longest coastline in the Baltic Sea, and we have unique capabilities in all four dimensions, naval dimensions, air, surface, undersurface, and sea bottom. And these capabilities have been adopted to the very specific operational environment in the Baltic Sea. And here we're cooperating very closely with Poland. We're also cooperating with Poland when it comes to the so-called CTF, the Commander Task Force based in Rostock, together with both Poland and Germany. This CTF task force is tasked to lead naval units in the Baltic Sea, NATO's naval units in the Baltic Sea, and we're cooperating with Poland here. Also, just two other issues which I think are very important. We cooperate very closely when it comes to civil protection and civil defense, where we have a lot to learn from each other, and also cooperation between our defense industries. It's in our interest to develop Poland's defense industrial base, and we believe it's in Poland's interest to strengthen our industrial base. So we're looking very much for partnership between our defense industries and things we can do together to partner up.
Ambassador, Poland currently holds the presidency of the Council of the European Union, and after Poland, Denmark is going to take over that council's leadership. Now, does Sweden have any specific expectations for the upcoming EU Council presidency led by Denmark that's going to take over, especially in relation to neighboring countries? And do tell us a few words about Poland holding this position right now and the importance of it, again, for our region.
Well, I mean, we are like-minded with Poland, Denmark, and also the other Nordic Baltic countries in a broad range of important EU issues. And Poland can really count on Sweden to be a staunch supporter during your helm at the EU Council. We very much welcome the fact that Poland has placed security at the center of your presidency. We share the view that Europe needs to take a much stronger, bigger responsibility for our own security. And Poland is obviously leading by example, given how much you invest in your defense, which is also European defense. Another area where we are very much like-minded is obviously support for Ukraine. This is the most important foreign policy priority for Sweden. And last week we presented a new support package, military support package, which is actually the biggest that we have presented. And the total support for Ukraine from Sweden amounts to 26 billion zlotys. And an interesting fact is, if you would count the Nordic Baltic countries as one entity, we would be the second biggest provider of military support for Ukraine after the US. Enlargement, also very important priority for the Polish presidency, which we fully support. We hope to make progress when it comes to Ukraine and Moldova's accession process. Obviously, it has to be merit-based, but the EU membership